Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good afternoon. I'm Alex Petriashvili, and I have the honor to represent Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. Today we start a series of discussions on the topic, which has, in my view, without exaggeration, the existential importance for Georgia. NATO Enlargement Perspectives. Last year, North Macedonia officially joined the North Atlantic Alliance and has become the 30th member of the most successful political military bloc in the global history. This was an important approval to the NATO's Open Door Policy. But now there are the questions which need to be answered. What are the NATO enlargement perspectives? Who could be the next member of NATO? When it could happen? What are the obstacles and the challenges to further enlargement? We may not get the exact answers on the above mentioned questions today, but we will have the opportunity to discuss NATO enlargement perspectives with the most experienced diplomats and academicians in this field. I'm sure you all know our panelists today, which we have the honor to represent to you and share their views on this very important issue. But still, this is the really a great honor and privilege to give the floor to the most distinguished guests to our discussion. Minister Linkevicius is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, prominent politician, diplomat, and very, very well known in Georgia as well as across the world. And he's a great friend of Georgia without really exaggerations. Welcome, Minister Linkevicius. And so, of course, Lithuania is the strongest supporter of Georgia's NATO integration, and Minister Linkevicius has always been among the leaders in his country and across the Euro-Atlantic community who strongly advocates for NATO further enlargement. Ambassador Volker is one of the most experienced U.S. diplomats I have the honor to know. Welcome, Ambassador. He has the experience of being the U.S. ambassador to NATO, and he's really very active and outspoken supporter of Georgia's integration, democratic development, and integration in NATO. And it is a really big privilege for me to have Ambassador Volker today to share his views on the issues of enlargement perspectives. Mr. Tenzer is representing French Academician Society and has kindly agreed to our invitation for this discussion. Welcome, Mr. Tenzer. We are very much grateful for having you here today at this very interesting panel this afternoon and this morning for good. Yeah, I know that Minister Linkevicius is limited in time, so without further delay, Minister Linkevicius, the floor is yours. Please share with us the views on your views on the perspective of how will develop the perspectives. What are the challenges? What are the obstacles, and what are the perspectives for further NATO enlargement? The floor is yours, Minister.
Thank you, Alex. Do you hear me? I hope you do.
Yes.
Thank you. That's good. That's okay. Working. So thank you, Alex. It's good to see you and good to hear, and also good to see all other colleagues. This issue is discussed many times, as we all know, and through all these years and then changing governments in Georgia, we always try to focus on this issue as matters, whatever happens. And it's always good to take stock where we are. So I'm always saying that we have a lot of in your possession, and looking through these years and summit in Wales, to mention, for instance, and also when this substantial package of measures was drafted for Georgia, or liaison office was established, NATO liaison office in 2010. We provided strategic level advice through these mechanisms through annual national program, joint evaluation training center, not counting that special council, NATO Georgian Council existing, and promise of the membership. In 2008, Bucharest summit, and it was agreed that Georgia will be member of NATO. So what else, right, needed? Everything you got except the decision. And this decision is political. So very important to understand that whatever happens, it's not like technical process, like in European Union, you have chapters to open, to close, there is a process, adjustment of legal basis, which is also very important also in NATO, but finally in NATO you have political decision. That means you need consensus. And here we go, and that's exactly the case. So in short, I believe everything with regard to the leverages, mechanisms, feedback mechanisms, strategic advice, packages, whatever, you have it. You also have promise of membership, which is also very important. I probably told you some time ago that when I'm comparing our way to NATO in Lithuania, it's a bit different, it's a bit different. And when I was ambassador to NATO, I remember even in 99, 2000, I was told by future allies that Lithuania will never be member of NATO, never. And that was told quite clearly, it said, be realistic, this is it's nice to see your freedom fight, also nice to see your performance of reforms, but you will never be member. That was our encouragement and motivation to continue. So in your case, it's a bit different, right? You were promised to be members, it's written, so nobody can deny and challenge that you are not candidates, let's say, right? Yes, you do not have map, that's true. But with regard to map, I was also talking for long. Wouldn't be in your shoes, I would not demand that map because you don't need this map. You have everything as I told. Annual national program about the same structure like map. Strategic advice is given, very, very candid and very efficient. All these mechanisms, I will not repeat, are in place. So that therefore you need just political decision. MAP was invented to have buffer for you, yet the additional political obstacle, because let's be frank, some allies, they are reluctant to get you in for the moment. And for them, it's kind of additional obstacle, which is really existing. And if you will overestimate relevance of this map, I do not think it's right approach. You should focus on the reforms to continue what you're doing quite well. You are one of the most active participants in NATO missions per capita, one of the most active. It was in previous operations in Afghanistan and now resolute support again. This is the fact. But again, having said this, we also know that there is no complete consensus on that. So therefore, you should continue. And again, comparing with my country, I'm always saying that you should be ready when time comes. If time comes and you will not be ready, nobody will be nobody to blame. So, it would be also wrong to think that everything is done, right? It's also not true, because as you know, alliance needs some so to say cohesion also within the country. You probably will not disagree with me if I would say that you really need to work stronger on the consensus between all political parties in Georgia. My advice would be even have some agreement maybe across all spectrum of political parties, like we did in Lithuania in 2002. Same as in other countries, our political parties also quite split of various issues, social, education, economy, tax policy, whatever. But in the security, defense, and foreign affairs, we're trying to have consensus since very beginning. I would say since 1994, maybe, right? And we really despite the balance of forces in the parliament, we always trying to strike a balance and to kind of find this common platform across all spectrum of political parties. And this is really successfully done for 30 years already. So this is also a strong argument. Why I'm saying this? Our colleagues in European Union and NATO quite sensitive and looking into your political environment back at home and this very tense relations between position and opposition. And maybe that would be a very important argument if you will manage to reach agreement on this issue, intra-party agreement, and where you put not only main reform tasks, but all overall, so to say, process of integration. And that would be maybe additional stimulus to the opponents to drop a bit the skepticism, which is, let's be frank, this existing. So I would say it would be really wrong to think that you achieved nothing, because it's not true. You achieve a lot. You are one of the front runners. You're really doing quite well. I will not repeat. But would be also equally wrong to think that everything is done and just somebody else should be to blame. That would be wrong. No, be patient, continue what you're doing. Try to build consensus back home. Try to do that along the way, maybe, as I said, maybe that would be the option. And time will come. Time will come, because our situation is really not easy. You see a lot of challenges, and sometimes one crisis not ending and other crisis is starting, and people are simply preoccupied with all these challenges, and it's sometimes very difficult to find the proper place in political map. So for us, it's a task, and I can assure you that we will never allow to put aside issue of Georgian integration. That's out of the question. But my point is that there are also other challenges, pandemics, I don't know, terrorism. Now we see what's happening in Russia, right? Navalny case, in Belarus, and more. So Ukraine, Crimea, Donbass, war is taking place. And in your neighborhood, Karabakh, I don't think it's solved. It's maybe not yet solved. The best achievement that there's no cease of fire. So I'm just mentioning conflicts which are also existing and drawing some our attention. So for us, very important to calmly and at the same time focused, continue the same way, using all these leverages you have in your possession, and can assure you we will help. The best way to go. It would be wrong to blame somebody, to look who is guilty, and to be frustrated. Although sometimes I can understand. But you look at Macedonians. You mentioned yourself. Now they finally accepted in the alliance. But how many maps they had? Yes, they had map. 1 year, a second year, 10 years, more years. Nothing happened because of the reasons which were so clear. So let's not sacrifice this map. Let's not overplay. Let's also manage with public diplomacy. Also mentioning many times, it's really bad when you raising expectations and sometimes not achieving something which is not achievable, and feeling that this is failure. This is wrong feeling, because there's no reason to feel like a failures. You really achieved a lot, as I said. So in short, that would be my remarks. You are doing well, continue, but focus on the areas where you need to improve. And your friends will not just stand by, but will be proactively try to help you. And this is the way to go. Nobody will tell you when. The dates are not about something we should talk today. Let's talk about the process, which should be robust, clear, irreversible, and this irreversibility also could be reflected by consensus among all spectrum of political parties in Georgia, and that's your strongest side. No, I cannot hear you, Alex.
Marks. Thank you very much, Linas, for your opening remarks. I really always think what is the answer to the question how to overcome the skepticism in Europe on joining Georgia and getting threats from Russian Federation. How should we overcome? Let us agree that just consolidation on this issue inside Georgia is not enough, definitely. What are the perspectives of changing the views in Europe, in so-called old Europe, on the Georgia's integration, Georgia's and Ukraine's integration in NATO?
Well, it should also would mention parliamentary dimension. Parliamentary relations very important. To go to talk to France, to Germany, to explain, to provide your case. I know that you are doing this, but this is also important to continue. And well, this is also a process of learning in the Western countries. You know, for instance, we trying. I would be self-critical now by saying that I'm also not satisfied sometimes with the reaction where we're reacting into the events, and sometimes we really too complacent, or sometimes quite our concessions are too big, and sometimes we're doing too late, sometimes doing too little, and this is really the case. But well, countries also going through national experience and trying to learn. Let's have another example now. Navalny case, right? His poisoning and now arrest and all these events in Moscow and 112 cities in Russia, and we're still quite slowly in our reactions. You know, still waiting for something that explains the situation. So what you should do, really, as I said, to be patient, to continue what you're doing, and to explain your case. And that's the way. So we also doing our part. We're trying to explain that this is not the only center of gravity, Europe. You know, there are also other centers of gravity which are playing not according to the rules, sometimes violating the rules, trying to impose their way of life and their system, trying to have veto, even undeclared veto right on the fate of other countries. And this is obvious. And by the way, this philosophy about provocative behavior still exists. And there's a difference in understanding. You know, I remember 2008 when we discussed this formula, Georgia and Ukraine will be NATO members. And we discussed the possibility of map at that time also. And there were colleagues saying that we cannot give map because it will be provocative, you know, because Russia will be provoked. That was the argument, and we said no.
Was it a mistake not to provide Georgia with map?
I believe it was mistake because after that decision, as you know, war started in South Caucasus, and 20% of territory of Georgia was occupied. So we told, look, guys, you were wrong. War started after our decision. And say, no, you are wrong. It would be even worse if we would do that, you know. So this is different approach, and still exists. So we have to understand that this is, as I'm usually saying, provocative when you're not doing something right, when you have to do. Provocative if you're not naming names and not, you know, calling the process how it looks like in reality, or guided by wishful thinking. This is provocative. Provocative when you are weak instead of being strong. This is provocative, and that's not yet understood. But process of learning, it continues, and then I know that you see what is the mood in the Euro Parliament. You know, very important resolutions are passed. These resolutions are not implemented by executive so far, but they are really strong. I believe maybe Kurt will say something, although I don't know what he can say about Biden administration, but as far as I remember, it was a very principled approach with regard to Georgian perspective in this integration. And US voice will be very important, as always, as it was decisive for my country. when my country was invited to join alliance, it was also unexpected for some. Especially, it was very difficult for some skeptics in European Union. But after 2002, it was more and more realistic, unexpectedly. So U.S. decision was decisive at that time. So I have no doubt now, when we will have again cohesion in our Euro-Atlantic kind of theater, and the new administration is coming, and I hope the voice for partners to support will be stronger than it was before. And that will be another stimulus. So again, not denying what you should do on your own.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Linas, for your views and sharing with us. I hope that new U.S. administration will be more actively involved in the NATO enlargement process. I think it's time to switch to Kurt, to Ambassador Volker, to share with us what he thinks about the perspectives in terms of new administration. And I forgot to announce that you can share with our participants can share their questions on the Q&A section, and then you can put the questions to our distinguished guests. So, Ambassador Volker, what will be the new U.S. administration's position on the further integration of Georgia and Ukraine and the enlargement of NATO?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for having me here, and it's a pleasure to see you and Linas and Nicolas. And Happy New Year to everyone in Georgia as we get off to hopefully a healthier and stronger 2021. Concerning the Biden administration, let's say a few words about that first, and then I'll come back to some of the points that Linas mentioned. And I do agree with everything that Linas said there. Concerning the Biden administration, people in Georgia, I think, need to start from the recognition that there are an incredible number of inwardly focused or domestically focused issues that President Biden was elected to deal with. First and foremost of those is the coronavirus crisis. Getting vaccines produced and into people's arms is the number one thing that he is taking care of. Second is getting the economy to rebound. The economic impact of COVID-19 has been significant. It has still not fully come back, and there is tremendous pressure on him to do something about that. That will quickly turn into an argument over budgets as well, too, because in order to keep the economy going during the coronavirus crisis, we've had massive borrowing and massive debts. And so there'll be a budgetary and a governance side of that. Another aspect is racial justice issues. You remember the Black Lives Matter movement that really took off in the summertime. That has not gone away, and there's a lot of pressure on him for that. And then finally, a lot of other social justice issues and economic justice issues are propelling the left of the Democratic Party in particular, and will demand a lot of his attention. So all that is a way of saying that, well, President Biden is well known. He was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate for years. He knows Georgia quite well. He knows the region quite well. He knows Russia quite well. This will not be the top priority in the early days of the Biden administration. Second is that when it comes to foreign policy, I think there will be a priority placed on reinvigorating NATO and our alliances, generally also in Asia, and trying to build a stronger consensus within NATO when it comes to dealing with China and when it comes to dealing with Russia. Right now, this is quite fragmented. And we look at the disparate approaches to Russia that exist within NATO today, with Germany seeking to complete Nord Stream 2 and the US seeking to block it, countries such as Lithuania and the Baltic states having what I consider a very, very realistic view of Russia, and others having a view that either ignores Russian aggression or brushes it aside in the favor of trying to do business with Russia. So these are disparate views, also with respect to China, that need to be pulled together. If I can turn then to Georgia in particular, what Linas said is quite important. Georgia has done an excellent job of preparing itself for NATO membership in many, many ways. The attention, the military performance, the contribution to NATO operations, civil control of the military, and so forth. But there are two fundamental issues that are behind the lack of consensus for inviting Georgia to join NATO today. The first of these is the view of many countries that it would be too provocative for Russia. So even though that is unfair for Russia to have a veto over Georgia's NATO membership, it is a fact that many countries in NATO, and I would say, and Nicolas, you may comment, but particularly in Western Europe, they view the relationship with Russia as a priority. They view it as too provocative, and they simply are just not going to go there. Which means that we collectively, Americans, Europeans, Georgians, we have an argument to win as to why Russia should not have a veto over Georgia's NATO membership. And there are a couple aspects to this. One of them is that it is possible for a country to join NATO even though some of that territory is occupied by Russia. It would mean a commitment to no use of force to recover those territories, and perhaps an agreement between that that aspiring NATO member, Georgia, and NATO itself, that NATO would also not be using force to recover those occupied territories. It would, Article 5 would apply to the unoccupied territories of Georgia initially, until they are peacefully subsumed back into the rest of Georgia. I think that can be done, and I think that issue can be put aside. Neither Russia nor Georgia nor NATO wants any conflict, wants any war over those territories. So it should be possible to agree on that. Second is more broadly, an understanding that NATO membership is not an aggressive step. It is not directed against anyone. It is a way of stabilizing borders. It's a way of stabilizing societies and creating conditions for greater democracy and greater economic growth. That has been the case everywhere where countries have joined NATO. In the Baltic states, to Bulgaria, to Romania, Slovenia, every country that has joined NATO has become more stable, more prosperous, more democratic, more secure. So I think that that perspective needs to be put forward again and argued so that we can convince skeptics, both in Western Europe and ultimately in the United States as well, that this is not a threat to anyone. The second issue, one of them is Russia. The second issue that causes a lack of consensus for inviting Georgia to join NATO now is a perception that Georgia still is not a mature democracy. And sadly, the experience of the elections in October and then the inability of the government and the opposition to come together to resolve differences over the election, to establish a fully functioning parliament, to reestablish a government with a loyal opposition. These things have led to a perception that Georgia is just not ready. And I think it should be a priority of the opposition and the government, both in Georgia, to figure this out, to find a way forward to resolve current differences over the 2020 election, to address things, to address irregularities that took place, find formulas for resolving those, and move forward, because the current situation is one that actually damages Georgia's reputation in the West and in the United States in terms of being a mature democracy. I think with those two issues, dealing with Russia, which I think is a collective effort, and dealing with Georgia's domestic political standoff, which only Georgians can do, those things I think are necessary to get Georgian NATO membership back in a positive trajectory.
you very much. Thank you very much for your remarks, Kurt. Just recently, during the Senate hearing, the Secretary of State, then the nominee for the position, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has used the very important argument in debating with Senator Rand Paul regarding the NATO integration. Russia threats the countries which are out of NATO, and Russia stops threatening the countries which are inside NATO. So how to move forward the process of Georgia's NATO integration, how to convince our Western European friends and partners to convince them and to join the Euro-Atlantic community. Is the use of the Article 5 and non-use of the Article 5 on the occupied territories could be the way of Georgia's faster integration in NATO?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think, first off, I think Secretary-designate Blinken made an excellent point there. He's completely right. And I would also apply that to the EU. You know, the Czech Republic and Sweden led the effort in the EU to create the Eastern Partnership. And since that time, Russia has now put forces on the territory of every single one of the Eastern Partnership countries. Most recently, Azerbaijan with this peacekeeping, so-called peacekeeping force there. So that is actually quite disturbing, that failure to bring closer relationships has created a vacuum that Russia has sought to fill. In terms of how do we move it forward, I want to, Linas mentioned 2008 Bucharest summit, and I just want to point out that the US ambassador to NATO at that time, my predecessor, was Victoria Nuland, who is now going to be back in the administration as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the State Department. So she has a very vivid memory of the effort to bring Georgia closer to NATO and the discussions around the Membership Action Plan and how to proceed. So I think that's a very good sign that she is there. What I think is important is that the Biden administration, as it deals with foreign policy, and as I pointed out, it's going to be dealing with a lot of domestic issues first, but in dealing with foreign policy, it's going to have to figure out its stance toward Russia. Most US administrations, starting at least as far back as George H.W. Bush, have started off trying to work together with Russia, only to become disappointed. And we saw that with Clinton, we saw that
looking in his eyes.
Yeah, looking in his eyes, George W. Bush, we had the Obama reset, and we had President Trump. So there will be, I am sure, a temptation on the part of the Biden administration to see where there is some possibility for working with Russia. I think they're going to start in the arms control area. And in fact, we've already seen them propose to extend the New START treaty by 5 years, and that will open a negotiation with Russia. They will probably also seek Russia's support on Iran and trying to find a way to reframe the Iran nuclear issue yet again, which means that they may be cautious about taking steps that would be seen as confronting Russia. I hope that's not the case, but I think it's possible. And we'll have to see how they establish a framework for the Russian relationship. And then within that, how far we can push to get Georgia back on the agenda of the Biden administration as developing a realistic pathway for NATO membership. Your question about the Rasmussen formula, about leaving Article 5 applying only to the remainder of Georgian territories and not to the occupied territories at this time, pending their peaceful reintegration. I think that is a necessary component to a way forward on Georgia's NATO membership. But again, it's not the only component. And as Linas said, and as I said earlier, there are things that Georgians need to do, and also this issue of perceptions of dealing with Russia that need to be addressed as well.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you very much for your remarks. Now we will switch to our French academician and our guest, distinguished guest, Nicolas. Please share with us the views of the French academicians, how you see the perspectives, further perspectives of NATO enlargement, the perspectives of Georgia's and Ukraine's integration in NATO.
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to say that I fundamentally agree with what has been said by both Linas and Kurt, and I think there will be absolutely no disagreement between us. And of course, I do not represent the French government here, but I think that's basically, I think 2 points are very essential, and I will just repeat because they were already said. First of all, I think that the decisions to enlarge or not NATO has not to be taken in Moscow. And I think that Moscow absolutely must not have a say on the future of NATO. That the decisions have to be decided between the NATO Council and between the countries who want to join. And I think that must be a point that must be clearly reassessed. And the idea is that, of course, it could be a threat to Russia. I think that this idea must be completely debunked because, as it was already said by Kurt, NATO basically is not an offensive alliance, but a defensive one. And I think that should be repeated, and especially I think to all my own French colleagues, and also to the German one, and also to the Italians, Spanish, etc., who could have different views on Russia. I think that's a very key point, and I think there must be absolutely communication on this. And I think that probably that would be my advice to the French government and to President Macron. I think that first of all we have just to forget about Russia. We have to forget about Russia, but we have, I think, to forget about Russia alleged, and I mean alleged perceptions of NATO. But also we have to be more aware, and I think that some of the people, in the government in France and Germany, as we saw with the Nord Stream 2 issues, etc., are not aware of the very nature of Putin's regime. I'm not talking about the country, I'm talking about the regime. And I think that's a substantive point that we have to make, because there was a lot of mistakes among some part of the French elites. They are considering the legacy of Russia, the history of Russia. They are talking about geography. They are talking about perceptions. And I think that's completely wrong. And I think that those people probably have to read Catherine Belton's books, about Putin's people, just to understand the very nature of the regime. And I think that still you have some people here in France and in Germany, etc., who are not aware about what's the very nature of the regime, not only kleptocracy, but basically criminal states. And if we are weak vis-à-vis Russia, and I think it would be a sort of blank check to commit even more aggressions in the future. And I think there must be more consciousness of this reality of Russian regime. Having said that, when it comes to Georgia and Ukraine, that were, guaranteed path to accession in the Progress Summit in 2008, and I think it must be very clearly stated that it's a right. It's not an option. That's a right. That's right. Of course, there is, and I think that Linas also mentioned that there must be, of course, a path forwards, and Kurt also was mentioning that there could be some efforts, and especially there must be a more visible consensus, in the political arena in Georgia. And we have also some concerns about Ukraine right now with Zelensky presidency and some of the turmoil and quite kind of undecisive way to manage the country, a kind of hesitation between appeasing Russia and more, I would say, tough stance towards Russia. And I think that's creates a lot of problems also in Ukraine, and even more than in Georgia, I think. But I think that it must be clearly stated that it's a right. Then, of course, as it was reminded, especially by Kurt, there are some issues, and especially there is the unwritten rule according to which a country at war, an occupied country, cannot have plain access to NATO. And I think that's a true issue, because on the one way, as on the one hand, as Scott recalled, well, there could be some arrangement, and especially taking the decisions that NATO won't help Georgia to recover, its lost territories, and will be a peaceful settlement of the dispute, etc., etc. Of course, I think that's some things that could be understood, and probably that could be the best way to have a first approach in order to convince some reluctant states, namely my own country, France, and probably Germany and some others. But on the other way, if we are considering what happens in Ukraine more than in Georgia, where you have a hot war going on, in the Donbass, you have the occupied Crimea, you have also the crackdown on the Tatars, in the occupied Crimea. You have the fate of the political prisoners still detained, in Russia, lawfully. Then it could be very difficult also to have this kind of thing, saying, well, we cannot have a say, we won't intervene in the occupied part of Ukraine. And that's some things that would be probably very difficult in a way to state. Since basically, if we consider what NATO is for, NATO is basically for protecting the member states of NATO, and also to create some support to the armed forces in order to be more efficient, etc. And if the armed forces trained by NATO, provided in weapons by NATO, etc., decided to recover the lost territories in Ukraine, especially, Donbass and Crimea, then what will happen? And I think that's a point on which I think we should be very clear, because we cannot abstain, because there were completely illegal acts by Russia. That's a true threat. And I think that's something that we really have to discuss about. Then I think there is a third point that I want to raise, which is the relationship between NATO and the European and defense policy. I won't come back now to the debate, which is, in my view, very misleading, between so-called European strategic autonomy and NATO. But basically, if we consider what could happen in the 2 decades from now, basically Europe won't be able to provide the security guarantees and mutual defense that is linked to Article 5 of NATO Treaty. And that's the reality. So it means that we have certainly to consider officially, and I think that France must be very clear on that, and I know we have a kind of ambiguousness about that. That's for a long time from now, NATO will be the only viable alliance in order to protect the EU and European territory. And I think that's a real clear point. And in order to do that, I think we need to have more allies on board. We need also to have Georgia. We need to have Ukraine. We need, talking about another candidate, which is Bosnia and Herzegovina, we need to have Bosnia also on board. No, from now on, Serbia is not a candidate. And certainly, considering the domestic politics in Serbia, the very ambiguous state, to say the least, still in the statement towards Russia and also China, it's not conceivable probably to have right now Serbia on board. But in fact, if we consider the big picture, in the long run, certainly I think that all the Western Balkans, including Serbia and Kosovo, etc., should join in a way. And I think that must be a kind of open perspective for that. And I think that we really must have this long-term view. What I am really very worried of is that from now I don't think that there is a true doctrines on how to use NATO in France. That's something I am, since a long time, I'm advocating for. I think there must be a speech, an address, something quite solemn by a French president to say, well, what is my view from NATO. And with the exception of the story of Brandes, that you remember, but it's not a doctrine as such, even if there are sometimes somehow some true point on that, especially concerning the future of the alliance, not NATO as a military organizations. I think we need to have something which offer to the general public and to the allies a long-term view of the future of NATO, and that's something which is lacking. To say the truth, NATO in Germany, in France, in Spain, in Italy, etc., is not centered to the public debate. There is no conversation, I mean broad conversation about the public, including about the public intellectuals, about the future of NATO. And I think that has to change. And I am quite confident that the pressure, and I hope there will be, from the US administrations, from Canada, from the Baltic states, from Poland, etc., will probably change the course of the events in the related countries right now.
I hope so too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have received a question from one of our attendees regarding the Nagorno war in Nagorno-Karabakh. It has really been evaluated as the tectonical change to the geopolitics in the region. Do you think that it will affect the NATO enlargement perspectives, the new reality which we have in the region?
Well, I think that I hope so. I hope so, because if we consider the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, I think there are 2 points that we have to make. First of all, right now you have occupation forces in the regions, namely Russian soldiers are there in the regions, controlling de facto the regions. Not only you have officially, I think, 1,600 soldiers, but you have, of course, a lot of people linked, according to some leaked intelligence sources, who are there in these regions. That's occupations. And I think, in a way, it changed a lot of the situation right now. That's the first point. But also, on the other hand, you have also the question of Turkey. And I think from this point of view, I think that my country was right to publicly address the issues. What to do with Turkey? In my opinion, I think, of course, we have to continue to have Turkey on board. But regarding what Turkey did, which is an aggression in Nagorno-Karabakh regions, that's a true concern, because as we know, Turkey used there, or provided Azeri's army with a lot of prohibited weapons, including phosphorus bombs. They were really, there are some reports saying that the other side too, torturing also the soldiers and the civilians in the regions. And I think it makes even more important for the neighboring countries, namely Georgia, to be part of the alliance. And I think that Georgia has a role to play in the regions. It could be a kind of safe haven, could be a kind of true allies that could play a very important role, in not solving the conflict. I don't know if it's really solvable, but at least to tame, I think, the conflicts at its right now, and also to have a kind of scrutiny of what the Russian forces are doing in the regions.
And on the last question on the NATO decision making, do you believe that? Do you think that NATO is taking its decisions looking over the shoulder at its Russian position?
Well, somehow I am unfortunately convinced that it could be the case. Of course, it should not, obviously. But I think that many people are still very afraid of Russia's reactions. Just have a look at what happened, just yesterday with the EU Council of Foreign Ministers. They decided not to sanction Russia. I mean, not exactly the country itself, but Putin's inner circle. It will be very easy to do so without any consequences. When you see also that the constructions of Nord Stream 2 is still going on, because the Germans just don't want to have a strong stance toward Russia, even if you have part of the public opinion and also of the political parties, including the Greens and part of the CDU with Norbert Röttgen, of course, trying to oppose. They are still considering, and I think that in the NATO Council, some states are still this argument looked also in other countries like Hungary, Italy, etc. I think those countries are really afraid of Russia. They are always trying to, well, we have to continue to discuss, even if this discussion leads nowhere, and that any kind of reset, any kind of engagement or re-engagement are basically dead hands. I don't hear you. Your mic? Oh.
Alex, you're muted.
You are unmute.
Thank you,
Alex.
Nicolas, for your very supportive and very important position. I hope the French government shares one day your approach and your position. Now we have to move to the Q&A section. We have quite a lot of the questions here to answer. First, let me start with Ambassador Volker. Here's the question to Ambassador. Skepticism toward NATO is raised in Europe, and it is even translated to the public opinion that China might replace US in near future. What should be done to deter China and Russia's influence in Europe? It's a very interesting question. And as it's predicted, Biden's administration will be more proactive on foreign policy in itself towards NATO. What can Georgia expect from the United States, and what would be your suggestions to Georgian officials in terms of relations with United States of America and NATO? Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I think we discussed the second question quite a bit. And I guess I would just say that for Georgian officials, what I would recommend is keep engaging both sides. You have a new Biden administration, some very good people, some very experienced people, Tony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, Jake Sullivan, and so on. But you have also a Republican 50-50 Senate, so there'll be a significant number of Republican senators, the possibility that Republicans will take the House in 2 years, and you have both the hangover of the Trump administration, so America first and a very nationalist, populist point of view. We saw that with Rand Paul's questioning of Tony Blinken and the hearings. And we also have a much more centrist Republican identity as well, represented by a lot of the foreign policy experts that are still around who were part of the Bush administration. Take Steve Hadley, for instance. So I think it's important for the Georgian government to engage all of these different points of view in the US so that people know Georgia, they know Georgia's commitment to democracy, to NATO. They're thinking about this rather than allowing Georgia to become something where maybe the Biden administration supports it and the Republican Party shifts into opposition of Georgia's NATO membership. That would be a disaster. So I think continuing to engage all sides. As far as China goes, this is a very good question. It's very important. We do not have at the moment a transatlantic common view of how to deal with China. In the US, over the last 4 years, there has emerged a very strong bipartisan consensus that China is acting as an adversary toward the United States, and toward our values, and towards a liberal international economic order. In Europe, you still have many countries that view China as an important trading partner, a source of investment, and are not terribly worried about China's use of technology as a means of extending its influence. So we need to have some very serious discussions in a NATO context about the security implications of China's approach, its Belt and Road strategy, its election interference, its 5G and its use of technology. And we also need this conversation in a US-EU context. None of us will survive without doing business with China, but we do need to have, I believe, a common transatlantic framework for dealing with China. And if we can do that, and that's a big if, but if we can do that, I don't think the issue then is one of China replacing the United States. I think it's more a question of the West, large sense, working together to set the terms of our common engagement with China. And that is how we should be striving to put our policies together.
Thank you. Thank you, Kurt. There is another interesting question on the foreign policy and international relations theories. So David Petriashvili is asking that it seems to me that all depends on not so much on geopolitics, but perceptions, norms, values, as constructivists would argue. Hence, reality dwindles and hardly anything can be predicted. Anyway, how strong seems the transatlantic bargain for years to come? Can we expect that NATO's relevance may weaken in the eyes of Western societies?
Let me take a first answer at that, and then Alex, I apologize, I'm going to have to sign off as well at the end of the hour. But I would argue that in some ways NATO has already diminished in the eyes of many in Western societies, but this is driven by, as the questioner said, by perceptions. And there is a complacency, there has been a complacency in Western societies that we are confident, comfortable, secure, democratic, prosperous, and that if there's any threat that we face, it tends to be more economic, from globalization, from job loss, from immigration. And those are the things we need to address. I would not at all be surprised to see a renewed attention to NATO in the future, because I believe that some of the hard security threats are coming back, even to NATO countries. And I think that will concentrate minds to realize that we still must work together.
Thank you very much for your participation, Kurt. I wish you success, and thank you for your time and for your participation. Now I will turn to Nicolas, and here we have the question for you that one of the attendees is agreeing with your position regarding Russia, and is asking that we need to be collided, and afterwards, if there is a harmful reaction of Russia, we should stand together. I mean, US, United States, and European Union. So do you think that Europe and European Union and European members of NATO will finally make the different decision, and skepticism will go away, looking at the aggression coming from Russia?
Well, I think it's very difficult to have any prediction, on this, unfortunately. Of course, I hope so. And I think that which is very important is that regarding the fate of Europe and the fate of NATO in general, I think there must be more voices across Europe. First of all, advocating for a very strong partnership between the US, Canada, and the European Unions and the European member states of NATO, first of all. And of course, that there must be more people. That's something that I said to many also ambassadors and ministers from foreign countries that I have that I met, either in Paris or in European states. There must be more voices. There must be more people being vocal on that. And when we consider trying to set the agenda of Europe, we have our own president, Emmanuel Macron, who is speaking a lot. And he's making some proposal. He's making a lot of speeches, a lot of interviews about the future of Europe. But if we consider the other head of states of government, unfortunately, we don't hear them as much. And I think there must be a kind of public conversation. And I think that's, of course, up to the European leaders also to express their view and sometimes to have some tough discussion. And we had one between, you remember, AKK in Germany and Macron about the future of NATO, but AKK is not the German chancellor. And I think that we must have this kind of conversations among the European leaders, very blunt, of course, polite, but also expressing the views about the future of the transatlantic community. And I think that is something that we absolutely need, because if we have only people advocating engagement with Russia, if we have also behind the closed door, like in Germany, people trying to forge an alliance with Russia because of, I would say, greed, basically. I think that's certainly not good for Europe. That's not good for Europe's security. And I think if I may also say something, on China, and I think that's also something which is also important, because we have two kinds of threats. We have an immediate threat, what I labeled in some of my pieces, systemic threat, which is Russia, because that's both a security threat, ideological threat, that what called a hybrid threat also, because there are a lot of components of that. But you have also China, and China, I think there is something which is a long-term threat. And many people in France, even people who are very conservative, say, well, we have first of all to address this long-term threat, which is China. And some people have a temptation in France to say, okay, the main threat is China, it's no longer Russia. And you had a lot of people denouncing, China, but saying, okay, we have to ally with Russia to confront China, which is completely misleading. And I think that's something that I saw in some part of the opinion, which is very dangerous. And I think that we have to be, in a way, generous enough to consider the whole threat. We have to consider, of course, China and Russia, but we have, of course, terrorism, Islamic terrorism. We have also to say, well, Turkey, which is, we are not very comfortable with what Turkey is doing right now, of course. But we have to separate the threats, to analyze them separately. But the idea is that we have to rely on one of the threats to confront the other, it's completely stupid. And I think we have certainly to have this in mind. When it comes to China, then I think there was something, and something that I wrote in a recent op-ed. For instance, the EU was very clear on the threat for the privacy, for security, etc., of the so-called GAFA, US GAFA. But in fact, if we consider the threats coming from the tech giants of China, namely, you have, of course, TikTok, you have Alibaba, you have Huawei, you have all others. I think that the EU is not responding very clearly on that. And I think that's also something that we have really to address, because there is, having said what I said before, also a very misperception and underestimation of the threat posed by China big tech.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicolas. Very, very important messages and very important position. I believe that Georgia has the very strong supporters of further integration and the membership. And We are very, very grateful for your today's messages and the attendance of this panel discussion. I hope very much that sooner, better sooner, this pandemic will be ended, and I hope very much to see you in Georgia, as well as our great friends Linas and the Kurt, and hope very much to continue the discussions on Georgia's further integration in NATO. Thank you very much once again. And,
my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And success and all the best to you. Thank you all for participating. And we will be announcing very soon another discussion on this issue on NATO's enlargement. And wish you all success and health. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.